This is a what you might call a Blue Peter presentation, in the sense that it's one we had prepared earlier and were able to step into the breach. We presented this to the Chiles-Webster-Batson Commission on the 3rd of this month. It's a 28-page report that we submitted as evidence for the Commission, and it's worth saying that, okay, myself and David are presenting it, but co-authors on the piece are Simon Goldsmith and Ryan Story. And briefly, we're going to look at 4 things: some data on participation, then supply and demand, and then David will finish up with some suggestions for a way forward. So if we look at participation, what you've got on screen is adult activity levels in 2020 taken from Sport England's Active Live survey. So the black bar on the left-hand side, 63% of all adults are sufficiently active to meet the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation of 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. And what you see is there are some very significant inequalities. So the green bars, men participate more than women. The blue bars, younger people participate more than older people. And once you get to sort of 50s, 60s, it falls off a cliff. People without a long-term limiting condition participate more than those who have. And something we're really big into at the moment is around ethnicity. So you look at the first 3 of those grey bars, they include white British, mixed race and white other. Then you look at the remaining bars, Chinese, black, other ethnic groups and Asian excluding Chinese, they have significantly lower levels of physical activity. But perhaps the biggest inequality is based on socioeconomic group, the orange bars. What you're looking at there is what's known as national statistics socioeconomic classifications. So those in the so-called higher groups, i.e. people like us, have higher participation rates than those in lower groups. I just want to have a look at those in a little bit more detail. What you're looking at here is activity levels by socioeconomic group from the Active Live survey over a 5-year period, 2015 to 2020. But it's almost as though you're looking at exactly the same thing. And so the key point I want to make at this stage is that these inequalities appear to be stubbornly static. And if we replicate the analysis by applying the same thinking to children, you get essentially a very similar picture. Child activity levels are different in the sense that children up to the age of 16 are prescribed to achieve an hour a day of moderate intensity physical activity or higher, and for that to be averaged over the week. But again, we see boys more than girls. We see it's only marginal, but people with a limiting condition more than those without. We see the same disparities by ethnic group. And the only real difference is the blue bars by age, where what you see is participation or activity increases in the early years of primary school to Y7 and 8 when they start secondary school, and then begin to drop. But the key point of note is, just like with adults, when we look at it by socioeconomic group, that social gradient is steep and appears to begin at an early age.
Taking a leaf from Mike's presentation, it's useful to define some of the terminology. When we talk about supply, what we're referring to is the provision of opportunities to participate in sport and physical activity. These may be formal, and in sporting terms, those are often club-based, or informal, casual activities. And this covers recreational sport and such as running for fitness. The majority of sports rely on having a place to play, and this may be as simple as a street or a park, or it could be as complex as a swimming pool or a water-based artificial grass pitch. This slide shows how the supply of some of the more common facilities has changed over 20 years relative to the level of deprivation, with more deprived areas on the left of the table and less deprived areas to the right. While there have been increases in facility supply across the board, the true picture, as ever, is more nuanced. For example, the increase in pool and hall supply is at least partially accounted for by the growth in private health and fitness clubs, such as David Lloyd and Virgin Active, while local authorities have been forced to close publicly funded leisure centres. Most striking, however, is the decline in grass pitches in the most deprived neighbourhoods. While the loss is mitigated by the apparent growth in AGP supply, this still favours less deprived parts of the country. In addition, the nature of artificial grass pitches is enclosed and usually pay to play, is markedly different from grass pitches in parks and recreation grounds, where casual participants can literally use jumpers for goalposts. The distribution of clubs shows a remarkably similar pattern, with deprived neighbourhoods clearly underserved. In some respects, this is unsurprising. The expanse of land needed to house a golf course or a rugby club would be prohibitively expensive to buy in the kind of inner city areas which make up many deprived neighbourhoods. But the same claim cannot be made for bowls or for cycling, which uses public highways in the main at club level. Conversely, boxing, swimming, and to a lesser extent gymnastics are sports which are well represented in deprived neighbourhoods, at least in terms of location. The problem highlighted here is that for people in deprived low-income neighbourhoods, access to voluntary clubs is restricted, presenting an additional barrier of distance if they want to participate in certain sports. Distance means time, and time is money, compounding the effect of the barrier.
If we take a look at sport facilities and who uses them, we have since 2000 provided the national benchmarking service for Sport England. And what we do is we measure how representative the users of facilities are relative to the catchment area from which the facility draws its customer base. So, for example, if 20% of the population were from lower socioeconomic groups and 20% of your users were from those groups, you would have a representative score of 1, and that's the dotted orange line across the top. So what we're looking at here is usage of sport facilities by lower socioeconomic groups. And we look at 3 classes of facility. We look at the best performing facilities, which is the green line, the median level, so your average sport facility, which is the red line, and the worst performing facilities, the blue line at the bottom. And the key point of note is that they are all less than 1, so they are underrepresentative of people from lower socioeconomic groups, and they are getting progressively worse. Now, on to the third section. This is one of my party pieces. When we talk about participation, what we're talking about as economists or management scientists is the demand for sport and physical activity. And if you accept that participation is the demand for sport and physical activity, then there are 4 determinants of demand. The first of which is price. And if anyone is struggling for a question, I'll give you a question when I've blasted through these. The second is income, and there's not a huge amount that we can do about people's income in the short term. And what we call availability and price of competing products, people in psychology might call behavior change. And finally, no, I've got that one wrong. The availability and price of competing products is competition, and it's individual tastes and preferences, which the psychologists might call behavior change. So these 4 determinants of demand work in different ways for different people in different contexts. And you also have to weigh that with what you've just seen in terms of facilities, clubs, and usage of facilities on the supply side. And this is where we give a shout out to Street Games, who sponsored us to do the research for them. And what they do is doorstep sport. So the barriers that they identify is the areas in which they work don't have much in the way of money, don't have access to transport. And so what Street Games do is they take the product or the supply to the customer, and they do doorstep sport from people's front doors. So if anybody's struggling for a question, here's one for you. You can ask me, Simon, why have you got a big bee in your bonnet about free swimming and why it's such a bad idea?
What do we know so far about the impact of the pandemic on participation? For one thing, it's clear that participation has fallen faster among groups who were already less active. Students, some ethnic groups, and households on low income have been particularly hard hit. While lockdowns have kept people at home, some have found this to be an opportunity to work towards personal fitness goals. But this is much easier if you have a garden or sufficient space in the house. For someone living in cramped, overcrowded accommodation with only communal outdoor space available, the challenge is all the more significant, particularly if those communal spaces are unsafe, or at least perceived to be unsafe. And again, this is one of the reasons why Street Games take the approach that they do. Even at home, costs are still a barrier. To purchase a trampette, for example, costs in the region of £30. But in the context of debate over whether to retain the £20 extension to universal credit, this is no mere trifle. As more data emerge from Sport England and other sources, we would expect to see some of these trends being confirmed. Stand by, for example, for the results of the Sport and Recreation Alliance's impact survey, for which we're crunching the numbers at the moment.
This is some work that we're doing for UK Sport and the home country sports councils, looking at tackling racism and racial inequality in sport. And I find it absolutely harrowing that in order to read this, if you look at the top line, what it means is 9.9% or 10% in round numbers of people live in the 10% most deprived areas. But 31.1% of all Pakistani people in England live in the 10% most deprived areas. For Black Caribbean people, it's 14.1%. And for the white British majority, it's below the average at 9.1. But just because you're from a lower socioeconomic group, or just because you live in a deprived area, doesn't necessarily mean that you're excluded from taking part in sport and physical activity. And in order to get your head around the inequalities and the hurdles that people have to overcome, just look at that second column for Pakistani people. They live in the most deprived areas, 31.1% of them. They have income deprivation, employment deprivation, and in particular that means the highest rates of unemployment. There are barriers in accessing education and training. They have higher risks of premature death and are more likely to have poor health. And it's absolutely no coincidence whatsoever that COVID-19 has had a disproportionately adverse effect on people from ethnic minorities. They're more likely to be victims of crime, more likely to have poor housing. And as David said about the living environment, this we look at in two dimensions. One is the living environment of the houses, so things like central heating, but also the living environment in terms of where their house is located. And invariably, it's about things like road safety and perception of safety outside. So when you've got all of these forms of deprivation conspiring against you, it's very difficult to say to people, there, go and have a game of netball, that will solve all your problems. And for that reason, the argument that we're coming up with is that these inequalities and the significant low levels of sport and physical activity are not necessarily a sport problem, but much more likely to be a structural problem. And what David just flicked up on the screen there is when we translate these forms of deprivation into inactivity or activity, you can see that they are actually pretty highly correlated. Pakistani people have the greatest level of deprivation, the highest level of inactivity, the lowest level of activity. And in our work for Sport England and UK Sport, we've correlated this across all ethnic groups to discover that there are statistically significant relationships. But the key point is that these inequalities are structural.
What is the way forward? Which strategies will work most effectively for the people and neighbourhoods we have highlighted as being less active? The table highlights some of the positive and negative effects of the strategies considered in the paper that we submitted to the Chiles-Webster-Batson Commission. I should say that's available online, or it will be available online shortly. What we should be focused on are the strategies most likely to succeed. And what we found in compiling the research was that it's low intensity activities, flexible in terms of attendance, low cost in particular, which are most likely to succeed for people living in those deprived neighbourhoods. Each of those removes a barrier associated with more formal forms of delivery. It's worth focusing on the last three rows of the table, however. Casual participation over formal, lifestyle activities over competitive club sports, and community-led rather than led by an external agency. And in this, street games have highlighted the work of what they call locally trusted organisations, which tend to be community groups, community-led, community-focused. One example from some research we did for England Boxing illustrates this last point rather neatly. In interviewing community boxing coaches, one of the coaches we spoke to was critical of urban regeneration strategies, saying they were often done to an area rather than done for, or better yet, by its residents. And our question is, why should this be any less true for sport and physical activity? At which point we throw it open to the floor.
Thank you, David, Simon, as always. It was very, very insightful. If you could just stop sharing your screen for a second, we can see any questions. Would anyone like to kick us off? Jeff?
Thanks, guys, for that. I guess the question is one of being pragmatic. So we have a number of interventions and potential funded projects. What should we be doing to access hard to reach groups, you know, in terms of developing, designing, implementing systems?
I'll have a stab at that first. One thing I would say is the expression hard to reach is losing vogue, because if you were one of these marginalized groups or disadvantaged people, you might look at organizations like Sport England or Active Partnerships and say, well, actually, from where we're sitting, they're hard to reach. So that's one set of considerations. The other one I'd pick up on what David was saying is around co-production. These inequalities have been persistent. If we go back to the 1970s and 80s through the General Household Survey, the early 2000s with the Active People Survey, and now more recently the Active Lives Survey, everything that I showed you from Active Lives, however you want to define participation in sport and physical activity, those inequalities are replicated and have been going on, you know, in excess of 40 years. So probably the key thing and the learning from street games is trust, low cost, on the doorstep, and it's probably more than sport and more than physical activity. It's about mentoring people, building trust, empowering them, so that when a short-term intervention ends, that activity that's been introduced to an area or a group remains sustainable. So given that it's the problem that hasn't been solved since even before I was a student, there isn't a simple answer. And it's because there isn't a simple answer that we believe that these inequalities are structural. So if you do something about the 7 dimensions of deprivation, give people better living conditions, protection from crime, education, access to employment, better income, deal with all of those holistically, then you might be in with a shout of encouraging more sport and physical activity. But trying to encourage sport and physical activity in isolation, do what you've always done, get what you've always got, which is inequality.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. I think Joe was next, and then PD.
Hi. Can you hear me all right, Simon?
Yeah, good, thanks. And hopefully David can as well.
Thank you for that. I suppose it was more, you kind of mentioned it there. So I think I left industry now 10 years ago, and it seems like, especially based on the information you've given as well today, that the situation's only getting worse, that there are greater inequalities, there's greater levels of inactivity, especially in those, like we say, those sort of hard to reach groups, but they're more significant in their aspects that sport and physical activity organisations don't have that big an impact upon. So all the things that you've mentioned are what programs have been doing for a number of years now, you know, making this be, you know, owned by local community groups and that sort of development. How can we empower now sports organisations, physical activity organisations to, I suppose, challenge in the same sort of way, to recognise that it's beyond, to some extent, beyond their control, and maximise the resources that they do have to put them in the best places?
Nice one, Joe. I'm going to start this one by talking a little bit more about the so-called TRARIS, tackling racism and racial inequality. And one new insight that we have is, yes, participation is significantly below average in ethnic minority groups. But the flip side of that coin is that the workforce in sport and physical activity is particularly undiverse. And we've been looking at so-called standard occupational classifications of jobs and looking at the sport and culture codes. And what we find is that all ethnic minority groups are hideously underrepresented in the sport workforce. And so an alternative way of looking at it is for people who are disadvantaged to be inspired, encouraged, motivated by people who look like us, or in their case, them. So one great initiative has been, it's widely accepted that people from ethnic minority groups leave primary school unable to swim 25 meters. Not all of them, but a higher proportion than average. And one way of addressing that has been making it easier for Black and ethnic minority swimming coaches to get qualified and then provide the role models and examples for the disadvantaged groups who may then engage with swimming more effectively than they would if it was your bog standard white British swimming teacher. So trying to answer your question, Joe, it's structural again, and it goes back to, well, who is responsible for implementing these interventions? And I'm just going to do a final shout out for a brilliant piece of work that we did in Birmingham called Run Birmingham, where they got a group of 50 Pakistani, Bangladeshi women to go from couch to 5K to subsequently completing a half marathon. And the way in which they did that was the activator, Naz, was a woman from that community who had their trust, had the networks. Okay, it's one person making a fantastic job on 50 other people. But it's those sorts of things that need to happen on an industrial scale if you're ever going to break the cycle of inequality, which has manifested itself ever since we started looking at these statistics.
Thank you, Simon.
Well, we're going to add something.
Yeah, and it relates back to the research we did for England boxing, and so there might be a slight bias here because we wrote that report for them, but the one sport that's present in significant numbers, or that's overrepresented, if you like, in the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods in England is boxing. Almost every other sport is significantly underrepresented, and while some people have reservations about boxing as a sport and its impact in head injuries and so on, and I understand that, and I'm not trying to gloss over those at all. one thing that we're aware of from that research is that 80% of people who join a boxing club, I think it's 80%, never actually enter a boxing ring. They never fight. They never box competitively. The reason they join is to be part of a club, part of an organisation where they can take part in physical activity. And the other thing about boxing clubs that we're acutely aware of from that piece of research that we did is they are much more representative of the minority ethnic community that lives in those deprived neighbourhoods. They're much more likely to be Black and Asian members of boxing clubs than you'd expect compared to the population profile generally. So I think that's one vehicle. The other advantage of boxing clubs is that they tend to be community based, and they tend to be, they use almost any space. They're not reliant on specialist facilities. They're not reliant on sports halls or swimming pools. They will set up anywhere, disused shops, church halls. You know, if you give them the room to operate, they will operate. So there are organisations, there are clubs in those areas that can reach those communities. In most of the other sports, those clubs aren't present in the same numbers, and that's one of the big hurdles.
Thanks, David.
Okay, Paul, over to you.
Yeah, Simon, David, great presentation as always. I was expecting no less. But my question relates to sort of impact and policy, strategy and practice. And the reason I'm putting it to both of you, because both of you have worked with me in a Northern Ireland context for over 10 years. We've always had underrepresentation in sport. We've always had plans and priorities and targets and around targeting women and girls, people with disabilities, older people, people living in areas of high social need, etc. But what's interesting about the trend data that you presented in this presentation was the fact that nothing really has changed over time. And I know you give sort of a 5-year window, but let's take it back even further than that. I think many things have changed, with the exception of the offer and the circumstances where people find themselves in communities. So there's always been community-based interventions, whether it be England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or in the Republic of Ireland. But if you look specifically at sports, there's only a certain number of sports have survived and developed in those areas of high social need, in those communities. You gave an example of boxing, and you know, in the Northern Ireland context, it's probably one of our most successful sports. You know, in the context of Olympic Games and Commonwealth Games, but that's only one of maybe 4 or 5 sports I believe on the island of Ireland can embed themselves within communities and contribute to communities. I don't see too many others doing it. For example, equestrian sport, hockey, etc., etc. I just see a big challenge in that. So I suppose solution-wise, what is the solution? Is the solution that this approach to community-based intervention is around this idea of co-production, co-design, where you have community leaders, practitioners working in tandem to identify and address local needs? And the reason I'm saying that is, if you remember, that was one of the key findings from a piece of work you did with us in 2007. So almost 13 years back. And to bring it back to my question, so with all this evidence, you know, that we're bringing to policymakers and to practitioners, they don't tend to take it on board the way in which we want them to. And I suppose a recent example in the Northern Ireland context is a new sports strategy that's going to be launched in the next number of months. It's very, very heavily focused on governing bodies and clubs. There's no real emphasis on community-based intervention and emphasis on co-design, co-production, which surprises me given what's just been presented today. So sorry for taking so long to get that out there, but I do think there's a question in there somewhere and around the solution, the approach that we should be taking.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you repeat the question, please, Paul?
Yeah,
Let me give you a quick example from work that we're doing in Greater Manchester. We're working on a 5-year evaluation of Greater Manchester moving across 10 authorities. And it's one of 12 local activities local delivery pilots being sponsored by Sport England. And the short answer is, we have tried many things in the past, and at best, all they have done is led to stability. So what we're now trying in Greater Manchester is something called a whole systems approach, which begins to address some of the issues that I raised around tackling deprivation. You know, tackle all of these things holistically, you give yourself a chance. Quite often, small scale interventions like, oh, let's make swimming free, is like a sticking plaster to, you know, somebody who's got a severed artery. You need something much more fundamental. So the next generation of interventions will be these whole systems approaches. So watch this space for the results of what comes out of Greater Manchester Moving.
The thing that I think I would add to that is our evidence suggests that the more successful strategies are the less formal ones, and that probably means not necessarily delivered by or through clubs. So the street games model is a very different model. It's doorstep sports. It's taking the supply to where the demand is. If the clubs aren't present in those areas where you're trying to address low participation and activity rates, perhaps going through clubs isn't necessarily the right way to go. And so you have to consider an alternative.
Both fair points. Thank you, Simon and David. I think that the whole systems approach is something that needs to be explained and discussed in a Northern Ireland context before a new sport policy is launched in the next 3-4 months.
Well, in Katie Shern, the great Katie Shern, we have a world-leading authority on whole systems approaches, and I would be more than happy to introduce Katie to you at some point.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one final question from Alison.
Thank you, David and Simon. That was a really interesting presentation. My research is on Parkrun, and Parkrun as an organisation pride themselves on being community-based. They like to think that they're very open to people from different socioeconomic groups, different ethnicities. But I was quite interested to see in your final slide there that you were saying your recommendation is that intervention should be not volunteer intensive. And one of the features of Parkrun is that there are a lot of volunteer roles, and that's one of the benefits of Parkrun in that you can get involved as a volunteer. And I just wonder where your recommendation came from on the light touch of volunteers and why you made that recommendation.
I think the simple answer is it's harder to recruit volunteers from people from among people who are less active anyway, among those participant groups. It's harder to recruit people from the more deprived neighbourhoods, and there's some quite extensive work that's been done in identifying why that might be. It's harder to recruit volunteers from among minority ethnic groups, from people who are disabled, and in all the surveys of clubs and volunteers and participants that we've ever done, one of the things that comes out quite consistently is that white people who aren't disabled, people from less deprived areas tend to be overrepresented among the volunteers. So it's I think the reason the simple answer is that we need to understand that finding the volunteers from within those communities, if we want these strategies, these responses to be community led, finding the volunteers to actually deliver that, to actually do that, even to train new volunteers, that's one of the first challenges, and that's an additional hurdle to jump across that might not necessarily be true for less deprived neighbourhoods, people who live in less deprived neighbourhoods.
I'd just throw in a point about Parkrun being a fantastically successful project and product for both participants and volunteers. And if you take my own Parkrun, Endcliffe Park, it is a victim of its own success, in the sense that quite often you'll get somewhere between 600 and 800 people taking part. And if we looked at the ratio of volunteers to participants, although there might be, I don't know, a dozen on duty, in terms of the intensity relative to participants, it is actually quite low. And it also works on a level that is attractive to potential volunteers. It's once a week, it's at a set time, whereas say in a club, if you're the treasurer or grounds person or whatever, it's an open-ended commitment that goes on forever. Whereas with Parkrun, it is a great model that enables people to volunteer without it being a perpetual burden. And in the successful ones, the ratio of volunteers to participants is not intense as it is in clubs. And that is because in some areas, Parkrun is this victim of its own success, where you have so many people and yes, a decent cadre of volunteers, but they don't outweigh the participants as they do in more intense contexts.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for the clarification. That's really interesting. Thanks.